All right, we are on the second half of the Unit 4 review, so we're just going to fast forward through the slides to get to where we need to be. And I believe we left off with critics of FDR, so we need to pick up with number 7, the second New Deal. Now, I did something here, and no, you don't need to do this for the question. Here's your first New Deal programs, and no, you don't need to know these for the second New Deal question. But I wanted to do a little comparison contrast here because I think it will make it easier to remember the major issue of the second New Deal. If we look at this first New Deal, let's see, we did reform the banking system with FDIC. That's a pretty big deal. We created a police force for the for Wall Street. That doesn't fundamentally change the country, though, does it? Let's see, Civilian Conservation Corps. We built some trails and some visitor centers at national parks. Doesn't really change the government all that much. Agricultural Adjustment Act. We temporarily pay farmers to not grow some food. Doesn't really change the government all that much. Short term, yes. Long term, not really. Soil conservation. Try and get farmers to change the way they plow and some of the runoff. We're trying to make it so that there isn't another Dust Bowl. Doesn't really change the size and scope of government. Okay. Public Works Administrations. We build some roads. We build some bridges. We build some schools. Doesn't fundamentally change government. National Recovery. We ask people politely to have, minimum wage and get rid of child labor. Didn't have to. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, that did have kind of a permanent change. It's still around today. So we had kind of a big change and kind of a big change. Look at the second New Deal now. Social Security, well, now with Medicare and Medicaid, that's 50% of what our government does. The Wagner Act legalizes unions, and the National Labor Relations Board, still around today. Holding Company Act, the Wealth Act, which increases taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Rural Electrification Administration brings electricity to Mound. And the Works Progress Administration, the single largest program, peacetime program in the history of the world. These are pretty big things. These are things, and also notice I wrote number 6 next to all of these. The reason why is, think of question number 6. I'm going to back up for a second. We've got this guy saying, hey, everybody should make the same amount of money. This guy saying Social Security. This guy saying we need some sort of inflation to help people pay off their bills. Well, those people had an impact. Here's Francis Townsend. Here is Huey Long. You can see the issues that they're proposing and that they're pushing. Long and Conglin are most popular in rural America. Well, here's something for rural America. So it really is a response to that pressure. And it really is also a recognition, hey, this stuff might have been good ideas. It doesn't solve the Great Depression. We need to get more serious. So that's really what you should know about the second New Deal and its importance and be able to explain that. Hey, the Great Depression and culture. This does relate a little bit, and there's a little bit of a holdover to some of the stuff we talked about during the Great Depression and the 1920s as well. And we talked about this a little bit in an earlier question. It's been a constant thing. Comic books, that's a new one. When we think of Batman and Superman, the first villains that Batman and Superman were fighting were, quite frankly, corrupt business people. And very soon they're going to be fighting Nazis. So, when these comic book heroes first show up, they're fighting the people of that time, who is described as, evil of that time. And certainly the Great Depression, people that are holding power over the powerless. That's how a lot of people felt by the Great Depression itself. Unionism. Well, now that we can have the Wagner Act, unions are going to be in the grow, are start to grow. So you have the famous sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan. And, you're going to see a lot more strikes take place as people start to demand better salaries, better working conditions. Writers, The Grapes of Wrath from John Steinbeck is a great example of, people suffering on the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl, people suffering during the Great Depression. And there's a lot of different books that will come out during this time period that will emphasize that. Movies, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was a huge success. A lot of people escaped the Great Depression by going to the movies. And I know some of you are probably sitting there going, well, if people didn't have money, why were they going to the movies? Remember, 50% of the people did have a job. And movies were pretty cheap back then. And people want escapism. And so, video games provide escapism today. People wanted to feel good for a few hours about the world. And movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and he solves problems, well, that was an appealing idea. We kind of did music a little bit already with, This Land Is Your Land. And, the paintings, I really can't emphasize this enough. Art is a great, well, not that movies and books aren't art forms, or even comic books aren't valid forms of art or music, but even paintings. I mean, the paintings of the Great Depression are desolate. I mean, everybody looks depressed. The tree is bare. The sky is not blue. It's not blue skies out there. Things kind of look stormy and overcast and a lot of dark lighting and shadows. It's kind of the way people felt at the time. Segregation and the New Deal. Yes, racism is a part of this too. So if we look, for example, at the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to not grow crops. It actually paid the owners of the land. Southern Democrats were very insistent upon this, that it not include or give money to the people who rented land. And a vast majority of the land in the South was owned by the descendants of FFEs, and a vast majority of the farmers in the South were tenant farmers, the descendants of former slaves. So they made sure that that money went to the land owners, not the land renters. Now in the North, it didn't have as much of an impact, and it wasn't really targeting any racial group. In the South, it certainly was. CCC camps were segregated, and there were much more CCC camps, even proportional to population, for white Americans than there were for black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and the like. Tennessee Valley Authority gave preferential hiring to white Southerners over, quote, colored, unquote, Southerners, so that there's a hiring preference. And you had problems even with the CWA, another one of those PWA, CWA. We had a lot of those acronyms that pop up that are giving temporary jobs, and again, preferential treatment. And then you had Mary Anderson, and this is a very important tell. It really does start to invoke what's coming. Mary Anderson gives the first desegregated public concert in Washington, D.C. She was an opera singer, very well-known singer for her time. In fact, the mink stole she was wearing when she sang is at the Smithsonian. And it was Eleanor Roosevelt who organized this. And it may not seem like a big deal to you, but this was a pretty significant deal at the time, that you see the first crack in the desegregation of public gatherings, a very visible one of the first cracks. But a very visible one nonetheless, and her concert was carried nationally on all the radio stations, and everyone listening knew what was going on. And of course, she also sang one of her songs, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," "Sweet Land of Liberty," and the words are biting sarcasm as much as it is a patriotic song. So one of the questions is how best to remember the New Deal. And unfortunately, the New Deal was a reflection of its times. Last few questions here. Hispanic and Native Americans. Mexican Americans faced a lot of deportation during the Great Depression. And so the idea that if, we can't have people, quote, stealing our jobs, unquote. Now, you have to keep in mind, a lot of the Mexican Americans that were deported during this time were actually invited into the United States in the first place. So there is kind of a little bit of a disconnect here, as we talked about the 1920s and the need for construction workers, the need for agricultural workers, and even those that joined the military promptly upon coming into the United States. So there were deportation policies, and we talked a little bit about California versus Texas, in the differences of culture, and in some cases more transient, Texas, in other cases more entrenched in forming own communities, and when I say entrenched, setting down roots and not moving around from place to place, and actually having a middle class. And a business class. Urban versus rural areas and how that was different in each area. You should explore a little bit of that in your answer as well. For Native Americans, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, make sure that you touch upon the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Reorganization Act. And again, America's still trying to get into at what point do you Americanize, quote unquote, Native Americans like you've attempted to Native Americanize people from Eastern or Southern Europe, which we talked about earlier, through schools. Can you force people to give up their culture? And even, with the idea that maybe you could abolish reservation and reservation land. And then, of course, the Pueblo Relief Act. Make sure that you reference that and its importance towards Native Americans during this time period as well. And then finally, the last question that we need to deal with, FDR and the Supreme Court. You'd want to go over those court rulings, the AAA, the NIRA, the New York Minimum Wage Law, and the Schnechter case, or the sick chicken case. The idea that the Supreme Court is starting to take action to start to roll back the New Deal, and there's this fear that they're going to go all the way and they're going to make the entire New Deal, first and second New Deal, unconstitutional. So this is Roosevelt playing some pretty hard knuckle politics. The Judicial Reorganization Act of 1937. Now it sounds intoxicating. Hey, for every justice over the age of 70.5, you should be able to appoint another justice. Why? It's tough work being on the Supreme Court. Long hours. I mean, they need some additional help. Now, the real reason he picked 70.5 and not 70 and not 71 was that was the exact number that would give him additional nominees to the Supreme Court, and now he would control the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court at this point was 9. It's been 9 through most of our history, although we have had 7. Recently, we had 8 on the Supreme Court. But it's 9, and so you just need to be able to control 5 of those 9, so to speak. And if you could add a few more justices and add a few more judges to the judges that already agree with you, you got a majority. Well, of course, if they'd let Roosevelt do this, just extrapolate what that would mean in the future, as each president tried to continue to expand the Supreme Court to fit their whims. It really was a reach of power. It fails. The Judicial Reorganization Act of 1937 does not pass. However, there's an adage: you can lose the battle but win the war. And here that clearly happens, because almost immediately after the Judicial Reorganization Act of 1937 fails, a number of justices start to retire. And in the end, 5 different spots are going to open up on the Supreme Court, and Roosevelt is going to place an awful lot of people on the Supreme Court that will fundamentally change it, even into the 1970s. The last of the judicial nominees by Roosevelt, Hugo Black, will still be serving in the Supreme Court into the early 70s. So it is going to flip the Supreme Court, and it will now start making a lot of very liberal rulings, which we will study in our next unit. Well, that's it. Make sure, again, this is the grading rubric. It kind of give you a good idea of what you should be focusing in on, things that you should be able to identify. And as always, I sometimes just mention things and you can research them on your own, and sometimes I do hit upon a few things that you should, once again, want to emphasize the analysis of things. So that's everything you should need to know for this unit. We only have one more unit in the semester, and that's got to feel good.